Okay, Maryland has about 400,000 acres at risk. We have a million people that would be affected over the next 100 years. There are a number of tools. There's a new product, and I'll go into this in a little bit more detail, talking about some of the products and tools that are out there. There's some online mapping programs. One is called the Surging Seas Viewer. It was just released by Climate Central. You can zoom in on any location, and you can move a slider bar up by 1 foot increments. And as you move that slider bar up, it shows you the land that could be lost, the amount of population at risk, the amount of property investment at risk, the social vulnerability. So we can get a sense, you can get a sense of that, because it's not the same in any given location, and we have statewide data and we have localized data. So we have a lot of tools that can help with that, yeah. I'll go over it. It's called the Surging Seas Viewer. Climate Central put it out. Sure. Okay, so we have one more pressing question.
Can you start by telling us what resiliency planning means?
Yep, I'll do that too. So, okay, but I wanted to get a sense of your interest and your level of engagement, and it is immense here in this room. I can feel it. So, I have a prepared presentation, but I can obviously tailor it based on the questions I've heard, and I'll spend a little bit more time answering some of those particular questions, and we'll save a little bit of time for questions afterwards. But I think you heard this morning that the impacts of sea level rise will affect all sectors of our economy, our environment, our society. We talked about agricultural impacts to the Maryland's eastern shore, the coastal impacts, storm surge. The impacts that are going to affect our bay and aquatic ecosystems, those marshes that are being inundated, and the ability of our marshes to move. We're seeing invasive species, impacts to loblolly pine in terms of our forest and terrestrial ecosystems. Water resources are at risk from inundation of potable water supplies and wells. Our roads and other infrastructure is at risk, such as water treatment plants and human health. So we didn't talk a lot about some of the human health impacts this morning, but sea level rise or storms obviously can cause more vector-borne illnesses such as mosquitoes, or obviously contamination of water supply after a storm. So there's a lot of work and still and a lot of issues to address with respect to human health and safety. So to answer your question about what resilience is, we call it climate resilience, we call it coastal resilience. This is a term. Resiliency is sort of, I would say, an emerging term in the field of climate change adaptation. We used to say that, well, this slide at the top, I used to sort of only show climate change mitigation. What is climate change mitigation? Mitigation is reducing the drivers of climate change, greenhouse gases or carbon, the inputs that are helping to drive the system and change the global climate. Adaptation is how you respond to those impacts that we're already starting to see and that are projected to occur in the future due to climate change or exacerbation of existing stressors that are already present in our environment and in our world. Resiliency is this concept that you take both mitigation, adaptation, and that in how we're responding, we have to, as a society, identify or enhance our ability to prepare for, adapt to, recover from, and more successfully adapt to actual or potential adverse events. So resiliency work is going on with that broad definition, everything from terrorism threats to severe drought to earthquakes, earthquake planning. It's in the context of disaster planning. You're going to start we're already starting to hear this term resiliency. You need to be resilient to any disruption, an economic disruption, an ice storm today, sea level rise, climate change. It's a term in and of itself, resilient, you're being resilient, but it's a term that's starting to be used in the climate context to really think about how we can build resilience within all of our systems, our economic systems, our social systems, our ecological systems, to address the impacts or recover from the impacts of climate change. So that's a little bit of rhetoric thrown in there, but that's what resiliency is. So it can be used on a very broad sense to talk about climate change resilience, but in a very specific sense, we're actually focused on a number of specific strategies or actions that we should take to prepare, recover, and adapt to changes that may come. Does that help? Mm-hmm. Okay. So as I talked about this morning, we have a whole set of strategies. We have about 115 different strategies that are in some form of implementation. So I'm not going to spend all the time talking about all those. You've already seen this slide twice. It kind of gives you a snapshot of the different aspects of that fall into what it looks like to adapt on the ground to sea level rise. So these are, what I'm going to do is kind of go over some of the higher level strategies and talk about some of the actions and then answer some of the questions that I heard. And for those who weren't able to answer a question, we'll have a minute, we'll have some time at the end if you didn't hear your question or your burning question answered. So one of the strategies really is that we have to provide good information, good data, tools, information, science, communication products, model codes and ordinances for local governments to help plan and prepare. So this is just a snapshot of some of the mapping tools. These mapping tools, they're information portals to share the underlying data, scientific information, as well as tools that can help a community assess its vulnerability to sea level rise. So Maryland, we have one called the Climate Change Impact Area Viewer. This is a map of areas in Maryland that are already experiencing some type of threat or impact that could be exacerbated due to climate change. So this includes our wildfire risk areas, our drought risk areas. These aren't areas that are being impacted by climate change today, but they're areas that would be more vulnerable in the future due to climate change. They include our sea level rise zones, that are, the 0 to 2 and 2 to 5 foot inundation zones, our storm surge areas. And then there's a product where you can actually zoom in and assess a community's vulnerability. Look, such as I talked about, the Surging Seas Viewer. You can identify how much of your community may be at risk. Is your home at risk? You can zoom into a parcel. You can input your address, and they're fairly user-friendly, and you can look at your piece of property and identify risks that may be, based on the shore. You can look at historic shoreline positions and erosion rates. All of that kind of information is available on these mapping tools. So we have one called the Climate Change Impact Area Mapper, we have one called the Coastal Atlas, and then we have other different types of viewers and atlas, and then a number of sort of commercial products are being developed. The National Atmospheric and Oceanic Administration just released a Surging Seas View, or no, that was Climate Central. Then NOAA has a sea level rise calculator. There are a tremendous amount of tools and products out to help assess vulnerability, but communities need guidance and information and a better understanding of how to use these tools and have a good understanding of what the tools and the products can be used for to help enhance a community's ability to respond. So we talked about human health. Human health issues, and this is something that I think that there are a lot more education and outreach needs to be centered around, is that sea level rise is an issue with respect to human health. In Anne Arundel County alone, there are 5,200 septic systems between 0 and 2 feet above mean sea level. So those are septic systems that potentially could be inundated over the next 50 years. In Anne Arundel County, if you increase that to 5 feet above mean sea level, there's 7,000 septic systems. So these aren't issues that you hear about every day, but they're sort of issues on the back burner that in a community you need to think about in terms of potable water, sanitation, and areas that may be vulnerable, as well as how these issues can shape decisions about where growth occurs, or where you would be targeting, or where a community may be wanting to focus new growth and development, to think about issues associated with sea level rise in the long term. How do we need to, what kind of public investments may be needed to support an area like this, like these areas in Anne Arundel County, or areas on the Eastern Shore in Dorchester County that may be suffering failing septic systems in the future, but the county may not have the funds necessarily to provide public sewer and water to all these areas. So these issues may seem like, oh, there's 5,200 septic systems in these areas. But when you start discussing this, you realize that the politics and the amount of investment that may be needed, and the issue associated with if a county were to provide public sewer and water to all of these areas that may lose water and may have failing septic systems, you would then be potentially allowing more growth in areas that would be vulnerable over time. So you can see that how when you take an issue about just septic system, it opens up this whole can of worms or an umbrella discussion about growth, development, human safety, human health. So those are the kind of things, when you think about planning for sea level rise, it becomes very complex pretty quickly and very political. So what I mentioned this morning is we're doing a lot of work at looking at our natural resources, how they can help us prepare, how they can help us better withstand the impacts from coastal storms or erosion. So some of the concepts, and I think Drew Kozlow alluded to this morning, some of the concepts around this are using living shorelines, more natural approaches to control erosion, such as in lieu of hard structures, increasing our vegetative or shoreline buffers, increasing a vegetated or forested area or wetland area, because those areas can help absorb the impact of a coastal storm. Making sure that and this is an area that we're focused on at the state level, those critical area amendments that Mark Konopowski mentioned actually talk about how we need to protect from development these key ecological features that provide this protection already, so that we want to make sure on a piece of property when we are developing it at the state level that we're recognizing that there's some of these areas, these wetlands, these buffers, these forested areas are already providing this key service, and we want to make sure we're protecting that service in the future by not developing there. Another way of using natural resources or thinking about sustainable buffer and area management practices is using erosion-based setbacks. They do this in Calvert County. So you actually determine how far on back a setback should be on a piece of property based on the rate of erosion over time. So you can project where that erosion may occur within the next 60 years and ensure that you're setting back a structure based on that rate and not necessarily a fixed, setback of 50 or 100 feet. And then the fourth thing is what I talked about would be specifically designating on a piece of property at a large landscape level, like they've done at Blackwater, is where these wetlands or wildlife migration corridors may need to be, and to specifically try and acquire or preserve or conserve those lands, so either from development or just from preservation, so we can ensure that these wetlands and other areas have room to move inland. So someone asked about regional approaches. For the first time ever in the Chesapeake Bay Agreement, which is the agreement between five states and 2 federal agencies, it is the major driver for Chesapeake Bay Restoration. The agreement was re-signed this past summer in June. For the first time, the agreement included a climate resiliency component, had a specific goal and 2 outcomes associated with climate change. So in the Chesapeake Bay Partnership includes New York, New Jersey, Delaware, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, the EPA, NOAA, USGS, a lot of federal agencies. And so I actually chair the Climate Change Working Group that's now responsible for writing a management strategy for this climate resiliency outcome. For the goal. And so it doesn't necessarily address, and I'll get to this in a minute, it is focused on sort of the ecological impact of climate change and sea level rise on the Chesapeake Bay. And so we're working, and then I'll talk about the infrastructure, the community side. It has a component focused on monitoring and assessment. We need to work as a region across all those states to better align our monitoring programs and our assessment tools so that we can gain and understand how these trends that Dr. Bosch talked about this morning are happening within the Chesapeake Bay, and that how we can use that information to help guide the types of decisions we're making about how to restore the Chesapeake Bay. And then on the adaptation side, the new agreement specifically calls for that we have to design specific projects to help build this resilience to the impacts of erosion, flooding, more intense frequent storms, and sea level rise. And so there will be we're drafting a strategy as I speak, maybe not today on a Saturday, but that was a joke. But we'll be going out for comment on March 9th. Which will lay out a plan among these states within the Chesapeake Bay region on how we would be able to achieve these outcomes between now and 2015. But I should say on the infrastructure side, or on the large from the perspective of, I think the question was, working together as a region on a major infrastructure solution like it's been done elsewhere. There are a number of other large regional bodies that are working on different aspects associated with sea level rise. One is the Mid-Atlantic Regional Ocean Council. They work on offshore ocean issues, offshore energy, living marine resources in the ocean, and there's also a climate change working group. And so I participate on that group on behalf of the state, and we're having discussions among other states and supporting each other and looking for more regional solutions to address more of the infrastructure and the coastal community and structural side of, as well as the ecological side of impacts associated with sea level rise. But yet I would not say that there's been any conversation to date about a major regional infrastructure solution to sea level rise like we've seen in the Netherlands or on the Thames. We have a lot of products and a lot of information now to talk about how, and this kind of is under the umbrella of that new Chesapeake Bay Agreement, how we need to be rethinking our goals and our strategies and the on-the-ground implementation and design of habitat or Chesapeake Bay restoration efforts. So there may be restoration efforts that are being undertaken to help protect and restore the Chesapeake Bay that may not be sustainable in light of climate change. So if we're going to restore a wetland in a specific area, and that we know that area would likely be underwater in 50 years, maybe we need to rethink how we're either designing that wetland restoration project or where we're proposing to target a wetland restoration effort. So we might be. So what we're doing is working with the restoration practitioners and those who do a lot of the modeling and the targeting and the financing and the design, to sort of look at new and innovative ways of accomplishing wetland restoration, looking at acquiring lands on the upward side of wetlands, so that and ensuring that those lands are prepared in a way that they could then start those wetlands could migrate inland. For example, it sounds a little bit complicated, but it might be as simple as ensuring that those lands that aren't wetlands today, but they're on the fringe, are free of invasive species. Because as we're seeing some of these marshes move inland and these areas transition, a lot of them are being taken over by Phragmites and other invasives, and so that then they're not as suitable, or that we're having other issues on the landscape that would prevent those wetlands from being able to migrate inland, or there would be a development or a road or some other man-made structure and coastal impoundment that could prevent a wetland from moving inland. So we're looking at sort of rethinking some of this restoration, some of the targeting or the design of restoration, so in light of what we know may happen in the future. In terms of land use, I think there was a question about local government, local land use. Land use decisions are held at the local level in Maryland. The state provides guidance and oversight in some cases. We have broad land use goals, and those of you who hear from local governments know, the Department of Planning sets broad planning visions for the state. I think in 2012, there was a plan issued called Plan Maryland, which is sort of a roadmap or a plan for growth and development in the state. And so what happened was we really wanted to have a conversation and encourage communities to begin looking at hazardous areas in making decisions about growth and land use. For example, I'm going to go back to that septic system example that I used. And there were also decisions at the same time that this Plan Maryland came out about where counties were going to designate areas for septic approvals. So, and I went over this a little bit. We recreated this new mapper called the Climate Change Impact Area Mapper that shows areas and we're working now with communities, encouraging them to look at these areas when they're making decisions about growth. Dr. Bosch mentioned this morning that in 2014, legislation was passed by the Maryland General Assembly, created a Coast Smart Council. This Coast Smart Council has the authority now to issue siting and design standards or criteria for state investments in infrastructure. So the state issued a set of guidelines for our infrastructure design and siting. in 2014 in January, and then the legislation then gives the state the authority now to issue these, move these, or put these guidelines into criteria. So I'll talk about some of the guidelines in a minute, but it basically, and the federal government, I should mention, last or 2 or 3 weeks ago, President Obama just issued an executive order at the federal level, which follows, sort of sets the same types of guidelines for federal construction and infrastructure. So the guidelines, and Dr. Bosch mentioned this as well, are focused on where you site a structure or a piece of infrastructure on the ground. And I've spent some time talking about the types of things you would want to do. In some of my earlier comments. One is you want to make sure that you're not putting new structures or any substantially, if you're going to replace a substantially damaged structure in an area that's most vulnerable. So we really are encouraging at the state level, the state investments to be located outside of areas that may be inundated within the next 50 years. So these are those areas between 0 and 2 feet above mean sea level. They also have to obviously be designed to withstand flooding from the 100-year flood as well as storm surge. So at the federal level and in Maryland as well, we also recommend that critical facilities, these are the fire stations, the 911 centers, hospitals, anything that's critical and has to function in the event of a storm or disaster, has to be out of the 100-year floodplain, needs to have a higher elevation or could withstand a 500-year flood. So you're going to set a higher standard, recommended higher standard for facilities or infrastructure that's critical. The federal standards, state standards are the same, and really we're working with we encourage local communities to adopt similar programs. And then also citing the ecological features that I talked about, those wetlands, those buffers, those we want to make sure that when we're siting new structures, developing new projects in the critical area or outside, that we're protecting those. And if we need to do mitigation on a project because we're impacting one of those features or a wetland, that we can then sort of target restoration to help sort of enhance one of these features so it can help better absorb the impact of storms in the future. So when we issued these guidelines at the state level in 2014, there was a lot of concern about, well, what if a structure has to be on the water? What if a structure has to be within that inundation zone to function? We have a lot of existing structures in these locations, and we know that we want to continue to live, work, and recreate, right on the water. And so we spent a lot of time thinking about the types of uses that should be allowed in these areas or could be allowed in these areas, with the caveat that if you are placing a structure or designing a structure within one of these most vulnerable areas, that you need to make wise decisions about that and how it's designed. So obviously water-dependent uses need to maintain their location in those areas. Existing transportation systems, we can't abandon those areas from transportation. As obviously we need to continue to support passive public access to those areas, walking trails, fishing piers. But you don't want to over-design those. You need to think about the life expectancy of those structures in light of sea level rise. So if you're designing a fishing pier, and yet fishing pier is intended to probably have a design life of 20 years, 15 years, you don't really need to think about, how high to build it or how large or how much investment you should put into that infrastructure to maintain it in place over the next 50 to 100 years in light of sea level rise, because it's not intended to stay in place for that long. But if we're designing a third span of the Chesapeake Bay Bridge, we would really want to think about what sea level rise will look like 150 years from now, because that bridge is intended to stay in place for that long, or it will in that footprint. Does that make sense? So we really have been thinking thoughtfully about the types of investments, how you would want to think about sea level rise and factor that into the design in terms of making some of the decisions about siting. So temporary structures, projects that are meant to stabilize or protect that shoreline. Obviously, we're going to continue to support the application of those in these areas. But major new investments, are we going to put a new, is Baltimore proposing a new casino? Are we putting a major, infrastructure, project in an area that doesn't necessarily need to be on the shoreline? We need to really think about, is there a safer location that's wiser and safer for that structure, particularly from a risk perspective, but also a financial investment perspective. So on the design side, how to build. How high to build, what kind of materials to build, how you can weatherproof, windproof your structure so that if it is in a location that will be impacted either by flooding or storm surge or inundation, that it's still, you're maintaining a wise, safe, sustainable investment over time. So really the principle behind design is how high to build and the types of products and materials. So the state now requires a 2-foot freeboard standard for primary structures, and then we're seeing a major movement in this adoption of a 2-foot freeboard standard across local governments in Maryland and nationally. As I mentioned, the federal standard is for 3 feet, is at for 2 feet, but 3 feet for critical and essential facilities. So Dr. Bosch also talked about these natural solutions, and I've alluded to them a little bit in terms of those ecological features that I talked about. There's a whole slew of these. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers just released a large, comprehensive study looking at the impact of Hurricane Sandy on the Mid-Atlantic. And in that study, they really promote the use of these natural solutions. And so dunes and beaches, if you took a look at some of the devastation that was caused by Hurricane Sandy and compared community, if you've seen any of the information or the articles in the New York Times and elsewhere, looking at communities that had a dune in front of them and communities that didn't, in the damage that was sustained by Hurricane Sandy, you can really see how a natural solution such as a dune can help protect a community on the backside from a storm. So salt marshes, SAV beds, all those kind of natural ecological features help dampen or can help sustain a community from more severe damage. So oyster reefs, we are currently looking and implementing oyster reef restoration in Maryland. What we're trying to do is have a larger conversation about where these oyster reefs are placed or targeted. Obviously there are a lot of issues associated with water quality, conditions and other parameters for how and where an oyster reef may be sustainable long-term. But we also want to think about some of the benefits or the co-benefits of placing an oyster reef could provide in terms of dampening the impact of storms. So after Hurricane Sandy, again, there's a lot of conversations, could a major oyster reef be placed off the shore of Manhattan to protect New York? So, obviously there's a lot of talk about using natural solutions. They can often be lower in cost, but they also have less ecological damage than a hard structure or some sort of man-made barrier. So barrier islands, Assateague Island, Ocean City, but we're talking more of the natural solutions, and then so the forested areas that I talked about. How are we doing on time?
10:30, 1:30, 15.
Okay. So we talked about those inland. I'm not going to spend a lot more time on this, but we've talked about those inland migration of wetland ecosystems. We have mapped that in Maryland. Those mappers, those products that I talked about, the Coastal Atlas and other, talk about where these wetlands may migrate inland due to sea level rise. It's called the sea level rise affecting marsh migration model. We are able to model where wetlands move because we have that great high resolution topographic data that I talked about that allows us to very accurately measure the land surface elevation. And then based on sediment supply and marsh vegetation and then sea level rise projections, we can model where wetlands would be able to migrate inland. So we also are thinking about how to work with local communities and local landowners to protect some of those areas where we'd like to see wetlands move inland or protect some of those key ecological features. So a few years ago, we created a new easement program within the Maryland program Open Space called a Coastal Resilience Easement. I don't know if some of you are familiar with our, coastal reserve enhancement programs and other types of easement programs that the state has to acquire and preserve or target areas for specific ecological value. So what we wanted to do was try and identify some aspects associated with sea level rise, or and look for ways that we could conserve or preserve certain areas of Maryland that could help us, that would be more beneficial to have those areas in the future. So And the easement provisions, and when I read these off, you'll see they talk, we can use now specific easement provisions that help us achieve some of the things that I've talked about. So in these easements, and we've only done a couple of them, we're looking for other, landowners that may be interested in implementing one of these on their property. But what those easement provisions in a certain cases have included would be that we restricted future development in those areas that would be impacted by sea level rise by 2050. With some exceptions about, farm, barns and other things. We increased the buffer width around what we call those wetland adaptation areas, where those are those wetland migration corridors. We wanted to make sure we were maintaining a buffer around those to better protect those areas on this easement. We reduced the amount of allowable impervious surfaces on the property because we've spent a lot of time talking about sea level rise, but there are other issues associated with climate change in terms of changes in precipitation patterns, more extreme precipitation events. So we want to control, decrease the amount of impervious surface within the bay. We want to take a look at the type of shore erosion protection that may be going on within an easement, so we can make sure we're trying where we can utilize those natural solutions that I talked about, such as living shorelines. And then we required in a few cases that the soil conservation and water quality plan to be updated every 10 years so we can bring it up to date with the latest science and understanding associated with sea level rise. Yeah.
Are you going to have about 10 minutes for maybe a little more interaction?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, how much time is there following the? Are we saving time for interaction? Yeah.
Time management. Yeah, we're supposed to be through at 4:00, so we're going to have 10 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry. I thought you meant how much time do we have to work on.
Oh, okay. Okay, good. Well, we'll. Okay, so I'm going to finish up here. Thank you. By saying, I told you I can talk for a long time. There's a lot going on. But we have a grant program for those of you who are, obviously, everyone lives in a local community, a local government, called Maryland Coast Smart Communities Program, where we provide and we give all these products, tools, information, all of our knowledge on these issues to help communities plan. So we have what's called a Coast Smart scorecard. It gives a snapshot. It's a self-assessment tool. You can use it at a citizen level, community level, sort of assess where you are in looking at issues associated with sea level rise and coastal hazards. Have you done good land use planning? And there's a series of questions. Infrastructure planning. These are just assessing risk and vulnerability. And then after the assessment, you can identify some areas where you could improve upon within your own community or at the local level. So there is a grant program that the request for proposals was recently released, and that grant application deadline is March 15th. It's for local governments, so a local government is eligible to apply, but with encouragement from its citizens, many local governments are applying for these grants. And the grants can specifically be used to develop plans and programs to address sea level rise and coastal hazards. So to date, I don't know the exact number, but we've worked with Somerset County, Worcester County, Dorchester County, Anne Arundel County, Annapolis, Queenstown, Caroline County, counties all throughout Maryland's coastal zone to develop plans. And they're tailored. The applications are obviously tailored towards local governments. The local governments develop their applications. And so, each planning process at the local level is unique. Communities know what their needs are, and then they can ask for assistance in having information from the state, data, funding, bringing in experts, putting on workshops, doing a detailed vulnerability assessment. Those types of activities, we can provide support and have been doing so for a number of years throughout the coastal zone. So a lot of what I talked about at the state level and the ideas in terms of the strategies at the local level, we have learned based on some of these activities that have been underway in working with communities one-on-one in Maryland to address these issues. Coast Smart Communities. Yep. So.
And do we go to the DNR to get that application?
Yeah. It's called Coast Smart Communities Program. Yep. So, here's my slide to tee up the discussion. How can you help? You can do everything. Planting trees, participating in a marsh restoration or shoreline restoration project, but there's a lot of other activities that you can engage on. It can be, you can lobby, you can participate, you can put on forums such as this or participate in forums such as this. But in the last few minutes, I just wanted to see if there are any other questions or if you could identify some other ways that you think you could help or areas you want to continue learning about things I've talked about or other information. Okay. Oh, can you stand up?
So the post-smart community scorecard grants, what, is there any incentive for communities who apply for that grant to reach out to the citizenry who may or may not be aware of the real impacts of climate change and sea level rise? Is there any way to, for an organization or individual to be that interface that gets that conversation going?
Well, many of the grant applications have a public outreach component embedded within them. I don't think it's a requirement, but you could, obviously that's something that we look for in awarding those grants, but in many cases they have a specific element tied towards that.
So how could, say, for example, a civic organization or a community estate or a local sort of plug into that, especially if they're needing resources and don't really know how to connect?
You would want to have a dialogue with your local government, and then potentially a dialogue with us to see if we could, help you form some sort of partnership or larger conversation. Then you could team up with them on that. Yeah, in the front row.
I'm curious about how likely, how much of this, what may change and survive under the new governor in Maryland.
I knew I'd get that question. So, I have worked for the state for what? Yeah, she was asking how much would change under the new administration. So I've worked for the state for 15 years. I worked under Governor Glendening, Governor Ehrlich, and now Governor O'Malley, and now Governor Hogan. So we have continued our efforts on hazards and sea level rise planning. I wrote the first strategy for the state on sea level rise, and we published that in the year 2000. So the efforts will continue. We do have, I work under the executive branch. So our efforts are, we will continue them, and we may have a different set of priorities or different set of focus, but that hazards, sea level rise, other, severe storm planning, all of that is it's protecting human health and safety and welfare. We will continue these efforts, but obviously we may have a different set of direction and a different set of priorities, but the work will continue. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Climate action plan in particular. Can you identify 3 or 4 jurisdictions that actually did that very well?
Well, those plans are state plans.
Oh, they're not local?
No.
Oh.
No, so the 2008 plan and 2011 plans are the state's climate action plans.
So you had recommendations for local?
Yeah, and the plans have a large component of those plans are what the state needs to do to help local communities address these issues. And so the way we're doing that is through that Coast Smart Communities program. We're providing grants, technical assistance. In some cases, we're writing model ordinances and guidelines. What we've done is make a choice that we really wanted to do is the best of the state level, and then to lead by example at the local level. So there are communities, and there's a whole list of those. If you go to the Coast Smart Communities website, you will see probably 30 projects that have been implemented at the local level and have developed, specific sea level rise plans, and they're all at varied stages of implementation. Some communities, like for example, Annapolis, the city of Annapolis right now, is really focused on how to protect and preserve historic resources in light of sea level rise. And so they're trying to be a model for the nation on that, because you have to think about, it's like the septic example I used. Historic structures have to be maintained in place and in their current condition to maintain their eligibility on the historic register. If they're damaged or destroyed, in the event of a storm like Hurricane Sandy, the National Historic Trust didn't have any guidelines for the types of flood hazard or mitigation standards that could be implemented so that they could maintain their National Historic Register eligibility. Does that make sense? So the city of Annapolis really wants to think, how can they protect these historic structures, recognizing they're vulnerable to flooding? And so they have a Co-Smart Communities grant right now, and another of other grant funding through the National Historic Trust to look just at the issue of historic properties. So there are communities, trying to think of some other good examples. Baltimore City is doing a great job looking at buying vacant lots in areas that would be severely flooded or impacted over time. They're looking at some pretty significant enhancements to their building code. We're seeing communities adopt at the local level those freeboard standards that I talked about. So there's a number of really good examples of what's going on at the local level. Through that Co-Smart Communities program, we put on over the last few years these information exchanges so that communities can learn from one another on the types of activities that are going on, and really they can share their lessons and their experiences. So if you're interested, I can give you some good example of what's going on in some other communities. A couple more questions? Yeah.
How feasible are seawalls and gates and things like that that have been proposed for sea level rise? What is that incorporated in models that you have?
We don't have any models that talk about the feasibility of those. We don't have I would say, I do planning and policy, so work. I guess I don't really know how to answer your question, but we haven't done a major study that looks at the types of structural solutions that we could use to protect against sea level rise. That said, that Army Corps of Engineers report that was just released, that's called the North Atlantic Comprehensive Shore Erosion Study. It was a $25 million study, which is a lot of money, after Hurricane Sandy, talks about the types of structural solutions and natural solutions that could be used to protect against future storms. So there's a whole chapter just on Maryland that talks about areas that may be suitable for structural solutions, areas that may be suitable for natural solutions, and talks about a framework for how you can make those decisions, because it's hard to say, but yeah, they're part of the solution, but they're not viable or feasible everywhere, and they're not from a financial perspective as well as an ecological perspective, they're not viable everywhere. But they're definitely part of the solution, or one of the set of solutions. Couple more?
I frequently see, as you're traveling down towards the shore on the Severn River, house upon house, almost tipping on these cliffs, and new houses added, new extensions to houses, and a couple of developers have explained to me when I questioned them about housing here on the shore, if you break the current law, there is a very small fine. And for a $2 or $3 million house going up, it's just part of doing business, that you can break the law and yet still have all your permits. And I go, this is ridiculous. If there's a $5,000 fine on a $3 million house, it's a drop in the bucket. They don't care. It's just another small expense that's equal to maybe the wallpaper in their bathroom. And maybe the state needs to stop construction on these homes that are clearly at risk, and at risk for the occupants, but also at risk for the entire community, because they are so close to the edge that when they fall, everybody within a mile or two is at risk.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wanted you to address, will there be permit stops? Will there be severe repercussions for breaking the rules?
Well, I can't really answer that. I mean, those decisions, are really local government considerations with state guidance in some cases through the critical area program. So fines and penalties and those sort of things. There have been bills and legislation that have tried to increase those in the past, and that's not an area that I focus on. I look broadly at climate policy and sea level rise policy, but I've heard those concerns, voiced before. But I would really encourage you to work with your local community or your local government, as well as through their critical area program, perhaps, to explore, and voice your concerns over that. Couple more. Yeah, in the back, in the purple? Oh.
Yes, I live in Easton and Talbot County, and there are outlying communities at Oxford, St. Michael's, and Tillman that are accessed by key routes, and there's bridges, they're small bridges that look to me as though they're subject to flooding, and with improvement of that access fit into one of the programs that you have.
Well, the county that you live in require an element of their comprehensive plan is a transportation element. Is a transportation element. Every county, as part of their comprehensive plan, every 6 years has to update their plan, and an element of that plan is their transportation element. So looking at sea level rise, flooding, maintenance, monitoring, their, what's it called? Their highway transportation dollars for transportation programs. They have to develop a plan for how they can maintain their road networks and their bridges. So I would encourage you, our funding can help a county, like we did in Somerset County. An element of their sea level rise strategy was looking at their road networks. The State Highway Administration has just completed a pilot study looking at all state highway systems. And I'm gonna stop. Well, actually, I have one. I promised the person in the purple sweater, but is that the county and the state, counties and state won't be able to maintain every road network in the event of a storm or a flood. So what we want to do is maintain, or in the county, work with counties to maintain what we call routable networks, so that there's at least 1 or 2 evacuation routes out of a community, and that those are the areas where you're going to direct and maintain and ensure that there's access in and out. So you have to work at the county level with the state, because of the state highway funding, to make sure that a county is thinking about this within its transportation planning aspect. Because evacuation routes, yes. Okay, one more.
I just wanted to make sure I understood. So the 2 or 3 foot freeboard, that's just for state or federally owned structures, right? It's not fire regulations or private.
Well, counties, actually, I thought of one thing I didn't talk about that's very important, but counties, there have been a large movement in counties as they are adopting the new national flood insurance rate maps, are incorporating those new maps at the county level. And the last count, I think it was 36 counties in Maryland have adopted a 2-foot freeboard standard. So most communities have it now. There's a few that still don't, still are at 1 foot, which is the minimum standard. So, but a number of communities all throughout Dorchester County adopted one. I think Somerset or Chrisfield has it, and Somerset doesn't. I can't remember, but. And then, we have seen a number of communities adopt a similar standard. And one of the reasons for adopting that higher standard at the community level and in engaging with your community on better preparedness and response for sea level rise and coastal flooding is because communities can participate in what's called the community rating system under the National Flood Insurance Program. So the National Flood Insurance Program, obviously, if you have flood insurance, your community participates in this program at the national level. There's an initiative under the National Flood Insurance Program called the Community Rating System, and it rewards communities for going above and beyond the minimum standards. And if your community participates, it's a long process. Some of our state funding through our CoSmart Communities programs is supporting communities to go through the application process. If your community is approved, on a scale, there's a 0 or 1 rated community all the way up to a 9 rated community based on the types of activities they've implemented at the local level. And it can be everything from better communication and education on evacuation routes to a higher freeboard standard or to maintaining open space in flood areas. The entire community receives a reduction in their insurance premiums. So it's an incentive program at the federal level for communities to adopt and better plan for sea level rise. And there's a number of enhancements or options in the scoring that are centered around issues associated with sea level rise and coastal flooding. But it's a way of incentivizing this work and rewarding communities and the entire community by seeing a reduction in their insurance premiums over time. So if your community does not participate in the community rating system, you may want to call your National Flood Insurance Program advisor at the local level and encourage them to research what it would take. We've put on a number of trainings over the last years for local code officials to talk about what this program is and encourage them to begin to take the steps to participate. So with that, we're going to wrap it up. I would thank you all, and I hope you learned something today. You can go to the CoSmart Communities program, and you can reach me on any of Maryland's DNR's website. My name is all over it with respect to sea level rise planning. And Kate Skaggs was here earlier. I don't think she's still here, but she coordinates our CoSmart Communities grants. So she was very familiar with you. She sat through the morning session. She needed to make it back to DC before the weather was bad. But so I'm happy to share any information in the future or help with any of you with anything at any time. So thank you.